Hey there, it's me again, Michelle, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. As an aside, and before we start, I just want to point out that today is October 30th, and we just got our first snow of the season. And here I was hoping for a green Christmas. Oh well, time to bring the toque outside, I guess. Okay, back to Canadian history. Today's episode, number 41, finally brings us to Confederation with the signing of the British North America Act, the unification of the existing colonies into a confederation. This episode is part 2 and the end of this mini-series. Now, as usual, before starting, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw in the last episode. And as a reminder, that episode was focused on the 5 main elements that made Confederation possible. We saw that by the 1860s, 5 major elements came together to make Confederation not only possible, but viable. There was a change in British attitudes. Britain was moving towards becoming a commercial empire, and the colonies had become a financial drain. There was fear of an American invasion, and 3 crises in particular almost led us to war. There was the Trent Crisis in November 1861, the Alabama Affair in 1862, and the St. Albans Raid in 1864. Then there was the impending loss of free trade. The 1854 Treaty of Reciprocity with the U.S. was lapsing in 1865 and would likely not be renewed. There was also the fact that the age of the railroad had arrived, that the vast geography of Canada could now be crossed, and rail would also speed up troop movements if required. And finally, we saw that the United Parliament in the United Province of Canada was in a deadlock. Then on June 24, 1864, the Great Coalition of 1864 was formed, breaking the stalemate and opening the door for Confederation. Okay, now that the summary is out of the way, let's continue with this video and finish our look at Confederation. Well, starting off, the maritime colonies were just as worried about the American invasion and the end of free trade as were the other British colonies. So the maritime colonies began talks amongst themselves of a possible maritime union. The 3 current maritime premiers led the talks: Charles Tupper of Nova Scotia, Leonard Tilley of New Brunswick, and John Hamilton Gray of Prince Edward Island. The Canadians heard of the talks and countered with a discussion that could include all British North American colonies. So a conference was quickly arranged for September 1st, 1864 in Charlottetown, PEI. This became known as the Charlottetown Conference. The Canadian delegation was led by Brown, MacDonald, and Cartier. Well, after lots of fancy meals, soirees, and champagne, the Canadians won over the Maritimers. And who did what was a tag team effort. Basically, Cartier and MacDonald presented the overriding arguments in favor of Confederation. Then George Brown outlined the constitutional arrangements, such as the continued connection to Great Britain, a central government with regional governments, and representation by population. Then Alexander Galt, the Canadian Minister of Finance, presented the economic view of the proposed union. And Thomas D'Arcy McGee, an Irish poet turned politician, presented the emotional appeal. He spoke of a new nationality and a new vision, something bigger and grander. The Canadian tag team worked, and the maritime delegates agreed to meet again in Quebec City to work out the details. The Quebec Conference was held in October of 1864. The Canadians presented 72 resolutions outlining the specifics of a possible union. The chief architect and main author of the resolutions was John A. Macdonald. At the Quebec Conference, the delegates refined, revised, and reworked the resolutions. They may have argued, debated, and even laughed, but they eventually came up with a final plan. When looking at governmental systems to choose from, places like Britain and France are examples of unitary states. They were single, strong, central governments, also known as legislative unions. This was MacDonald's initial pitch, but this was shot down by the regional delegates who argued that this would not work in a place as large and diverse as the colonies. Instead, a federal system was agreed upon, that being 2 levels of government, a central one to manage matters of common national interest, and provincial ones to manage local and regional matters. Now this is similar to the system in the U.S., with the exception that the Americans elected their president in a separate vote. This meant that the American national leader could be from one party, and the majority of members in the government could be from another party. The Canadians rejected this principle in favor of one that would be similar to the United Kingdom, wherein the party leader with the most seats in the House of Commons becomes Prime Minister. So in the end, what was decided upon was basically a blend of British and American federal systems, but without a president. And in this union, two levels of government would be assigned different responsibilities. The provincial government would manage education, roads, medicine, municipalities, property rights, civil law, justice, and natural resources. The federal government would manage currency and banking, defense, navigation and shipping, native affairs, marriage and divorce, criminal law, and seacoast and inland fisheries. This division of power would provide Quebec with the legislative power to maintain control over its own language, religion, education, and civil law. They were happy with this. And any unnamed or residual powers not specifically covered by this Constitution would be automatically assigned to the federal government, something the Americans forgot to do. Now, the British Crown itself would be represented in Canada by the Governor-General nationally and by a Lieutenant Governor in each province. And the federal government itself would be bicameral, divided into two separate legislative branches. The two houses would be the Senate, Canada's upper house. Senators would be appointed, meaning non-democratic and not answerable to Canadian voters. And the House of Commons, Canada's lower house. Members would be elected and responsible to the Canadian voters. So as the Senate is by appointment, it is not representation by population, but rather representation by region. Sounded like a good idea at the time, and this would mean that regions with smaller populations would still have a voice in government. But it's not working out that way. As Senate members were appointed by the federal government and not by the people in the regions they represent, they would likely be federal lackeys. Can you say patronage? So as it turns out, patronage, the awarding of jobs and favors to political cronies, has become a sort of Canadian art form. So why have a Senate at all? Well, originally MacDonald and others were wary of mob rule, of unbridled democracy. So to counteract this, they established a non-elected, non-democratic House to better protect the interests of the upper class. So the Senate became the forum for second thoughts after the House of Commons approved laws and regulations before getting final Senate approval. So now that the Quebec Conference laid out the terms of confederations, the delegates would take their turns back to their respective parliaments for approval. Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island said no. The province of Canada said yes, but it was a close vote from Canada East members. In New Brunswick, it was a seesaw battle. Pro-Confederation Premier Leonard Tilley lost the election in 1865, but bounced back the following year with a majority win and gave a yes for New Brunswick. In Nova Scotia, Premier Charles Tupper faced strong opposition. Former Premier Joseph Howe even went to Great Britain to have the British government block the proposed union, but Britain refused. As luck would have it, Tupper wasn't due for re-election until 1867, so all he had to do was pass Confederation before then, and no one would be able to stop it once enacted. Now the terms of Confederation had been worked out at the three separate conferences. Charlottetown, September 1 through 9, 1864, where delegates agreed to the broad principles of a possible union. Quebec City, October 10 through 27, 1864, where the structure of the union, the division of power between national and provincial governments, and other details are discussed, argued, and agreed upon. And then London, England, the winter of 1866 to 1867, delegates meet one last time and make some minor but important changes. They improve the financial terms for the Maritimes and add a requirement for an intercolonial railway to be built. that on March 29, 1867, Queen Victoria signed the British North America Act, making it effective July 1st. A new nation was born, Canada, consisting of 3.5 million people and 4 provinces. The original provinces, the so-called charter members of Confederation, were Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. It's important to note at this time that the BNA Act did not grant Canada full independence. Canada was still a part of the British Empire, and Canadians were still British citizens. The Queen was still head of state, and Britain still called the shots in matters of diplomacy and international defense. But the BNA Act was still a giant step forward. Now, traditionally, there are 36 Fathers of Confederation in Canada, delegates who took part in one or more of the 3 conferences. The most important Fathers of Confederation were MacDonald, Cartier, Brown, Tilley, Tupper, Galt, and McGee. But the title of Father of Confederation could also include Amour de Cosmos, who helped bring British Columbia into Confederation, Louis Riel, the founder of Manitoba, Joey Smallwood, who brought Newfoundland to Confederation in 1949, and John Amagolik, called the Arctic John A., the father of Nunavut, the Northern Territory created in 1999. So if these are the fathers, who was the mother of Confederation? Well, it was none other than Queen Victoria. She encouraged the Union, and she signed the BNA Act. Well, on that very inspiring achievement, Confederation, let's end this episode here. Please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 42, What Comes Next. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this video, give this video a thumbs up and click that subscribe button below to see more. And remember, hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Okay.